All right, it's time for another review. So, let me get the slideshow. There we go. Yeah, cool. Okay, so last time, the last exam, we went over Grice's maxims. The questions that you had there were focused on what are the maxims and what do they mean. In this one, we're more concerned with what happens when you flout these maxims. So that also is in the previous video, what happens when you flout them, but that's what's going to be what we're looking at here. So go back and look at that, and that's what you're going to need for the questions about Grice's maxims, how they relate to sarcasm, overstatement, etc. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what's a good way to flow into this. Like I had an idea, but so Grice's maxims, when we're flouting them, it's when we get a little bit more playful with language, right? We're doing some other things that you don't typically do in when you're, let's say, just lecturing to someone or presenting information, something like that. It's a whole different group of things that you're actually trying to do. Another group of things that are like this are similes, metaphors, and idioms. So remember, similes are things like similes and metaphors, very similar. Similes like or as. Metaphor is calling something something, right? This is grade school stuff. Easy as pie. That one's actually kind of weird. That's a bad example. Let's not use that one. I think that might actually be more of an idiom than it is a simile. Okay, to cut through something like a hot knife through butter, this is a good simile. This makes a lot of sense. Or to say that, if you walk into your mother's house with muddy shoes, she becomes a raging hell beast. So something like this, it's a metaphor, right? And so these are common. I don't know if they're common, but that's exactly what you'd expect a simile and a metaphor to be. But what's interesting about those is that when you have someone who is learning a language, this is their L2 that they're learning, similes and metaphors are easy to pick up because a hot knife through butter, it doesn't really matter what language you're speaking, that imagery makes sense. So if doing something is as easy as that, or if you've got a test that you're going through and it's as easy as that, you understand that it's easy because basically that whole thing is setting up, hot knife through butter is setting up how easy a knife just falls through butter. So clearly there's no force needed, and that's why it makes sense to a person who's learned a second language or who's currently learning a second language. Similarly, a metaphor, you're just calling something it's similar to the simile. Idioms, though, don't ever really seem to make sense to a second language learner. This is the kind of thing like easy as pie was what I was going to use for a simile just now, and I think it's more of an idiom. It uses the structure of a simile, but I guess pie is easy to cut through. I'm not really sure there. My dogs are barking for your feet being tired. Things like these don't really make sense. There's no logical connection. And so people who are second language learners just don't get these. They don't really make sense. I have an okay knowledge. I used to have a lot better knowledge in German, but I have an okay knowledge in German, and I cannot tell you an idiom. I don't remember any of the idioms because they're so weird. Like you just kind of have to know them, right? And this is true for English idioms too. Like you just have to know that there's this code of words. My dogs are barking means my feet are tired. There's no way to like brute force your way through that to what it actually means, like there is with a simile and a metaphor. So, a second language learner, simile and metaphor comes easily. They're understood fairly well. Idioms never really get there. And even sometimes you can have someone who speaks the same language and doesn't really understand all of the idioms. So let's think about, British versus American English. There are some idioms that just don't really translate just because you haven't heard them. It's kind of a thing where you just have to grow up knowing it. It's just information that's encoded into this really weird system, and that's why we know it. Okay, and then another playful thing you can do with language is swear. So some things that are cool about swearing is that they can actually help reduce pain. People who are in pain from different chronic conditions will actually, if they express themselves using swear words, it tends to reduce pain. We can test this out experimentally too by having people put their hands into freezing cold water and then have some people swear, some people use analogs of those swear words but that are more polite, and then also made up words or just random words. And the people who are actually using swear words are able to withstand the pain longer and report lower overall pain levels. So it seems like swearing works in that way. Also, people can cope better with chronic conditions if they swear more often. So this is a reason why it tends to be more acceptable in our culture for males to swear more than females. And so it tends to be that with really chronic conditions that have some pain associated with them, men tend to do better mentally, and this may have something to do with it, because we'll actually see that if women are encouraged to swear more, they will cope a little bit better. Of course, there's a bunch of other things that are coiled up around this research because we can't really control any of this. It's not a well-controlled study because you have to look at people who have these conditions, and then you can't control the progression of these conditions either. But it seems that it can actually help with coping. My research shows that swearing follows specific vowel patterns, namely sounds that are close to a and So that if you look at a graph, I think I put one of these in the lecture slides for this last one, but if I didn't, it's okay. There's some sounds that are clustered close to a, and is there, I is close, and those sounds tend to be where the vowels for swear words are clustered. There's also sounds that have no swear words, and those tend to be oo and e. And there's not a lot of oo and e swear words. That also tends to be where we focus our words that we direct at children. So like parentese, or I guess infant-directed speech is the scientific definition of that. But it's the kind of thing that you say to your dogs and children, and if you're just kind of like making fun of things. So like you'll use... I honestly can't think of anything right now, but nothing is coming to mind. I don't know. I have a dog. Can't think of anything like this. Oh, walkies, you might say. Instead of like, do you want to go for a walk? You might say walkies, so you have E. People also tend to add oo to these things. And so it seems like there is an innate... Not innate, because you know that I don't necessarily enjoy innate arguments, but there is something maybe learned, maybe that relates to the muscular structure of saying e and oo versus a and There might be something related to the sound of it. We know a tends to be a bit more dissonant than oo, and tends to be voiced at a lower pitch than E. So it could be something like that. But there's definitely patterns, reliable patterns, to where swear words are and where swear words are not. And then lastly, swearing is actually not common in Tourette's syndrome. It's one of, I think, the most alarming things that can come up is when someone swears with their Tourette's syndrome. But a lot of times it's tics, it's just noises, it's little outbursts or something like that. But swearing is actually around less than 20% of people with Tourette's syndrome will actually swear. And of those, not all of them always swear with Tourette's syndrome. It's just something that comes on. Of course, there are some who have swearing specific Tourette's syndrome, but that's just kind of like their thing is the swearing. It's not that Tourette's syndrome makes you swear. Additionally, when people who have Tourette's syndrome are told not to exhibit their tics, swearing, whatever the tic is, just like twitching, making noises, whatever it is, then they tend to make more of them because they're focusing on not making them. And that somehow right there, focusing on not making them actually increases the propensity to make those tics. So when they are in a situation where it doesn't matter if they swear or have a tic or make a noise or whatever, they'll actually make less of them than when they shouldn't. Okay, so let's talk about the word that and some jokes. Complementizers are things like that and how and what. And what the heck do they do? Well, they help disambiguate clauses. That's specifically what complementizers do. They kind of set clauses aside, especially when prosody can't do the job. So we know that prosody kind of functions like complementizers. If you say some of our garden path sentences with the right prosody, the old man the boat, that gives you an idea that we're emphasizing old, there's a space between old and man, that there's some other meaning there. So we're helping with prosody disambiguate this. You could also say the old that man the boat, it is the old that man the boat, it is the old who man the boat. In some dialects of British English, it's the old what man the boat, you might say. And so these are all complementizers, adding these in to disambiguate clauses from one another. It's when we're not using prosody or complementizers that you end up getting garden path sentences. And now, this is these three don't necessarily have a logical flow with one another. The jokes in the Williams syndrome do, but not the complementizers. Williams syndrome is a very language-specific disorder, and what I mean by that is language is not impaired with this disorder. People with Williams syndrome are very linguistically adept. They know a lot of words. Their word knowledge is high. Their ability to talk to people is possibly better than people that don't have Williams syndrome. They're extremely friendly. They're also very musically inclined. And again, no language impairments at all. However, they do have severe intellectual impairments. So it's interesting that they have large amounts of language knowledge, large amounts of musical knowledge, and then when you ask them to do tasks where you would be measuring their IQ, they can't. So it's kind of like they have wholesale intellectual impairments, except for language and music. They might be the origin of the elf legend in the medieval era, because it is possible that they would be sent off away from their family to places, that just housed other people with Williams syndrome. They would play music and talk to people and be like these friendly, carefree, musical, magical people, it might seem like. And that might be where the origin of this idea of elves actually comes from. The opposite of Williams syndrome seems to be specific language impairment. In this, we actually see people who have no intellectual disabilities except for language. It seems like everything else goes in just fine. And then there are severe language-specific impairments. So they're kind of like the extreme opposites of one another. Williams syndrome, highly high deficits, I guess is what I'll say, except for language. And then specific language impairment, very low amounts of deficits or normally functioning, except for language. And then some things that people with Williams syndrome really enjoy are jokes. They really enjoy telling jokes. Interestingly, one thing that happens with jokes is that jokes tend to take advantage of our surprise, oddball, and insight responses. So when you hear a punchline, it might trigger a moment of insight, which we can see with EEG. We can also see surprise and oddball responses with EEG as well. So different kinds of jokes kind of capitalize on different of these responses, but kind of what you're looking for with jokes is that it tends to be correlated with one of these types of spikes, these neural spikes. Obviously not all of them, obviously not everything. There are things that can be funny that are just kind of like situationally funny. They don't necessarily coincide with these spikes, or there's that kind of like cringe funniness that is just like a slow, uncomfortable thing. I don't really think it's necessarily always funny so much as it is awkward, I guess. But anyway, that's my take on it. But jokes tend to, especially jokes with like a punchline or an expectation of a punchline, and then there isn't one, take kind of hijack the surprise, oddball, or insight response. Now, that's not to say that the surprise, oddball, and insight response are the same, but there's a similarity to them in that there is a spike of, oh, I didn't expect that, or oh, I understand this now, or something like that. There was an attempt to find the funniest joke. In fact, there have been a couple, but we talked about one in particular. And the results of this funniest joke was that it wasn't very funny. It was okay. It was okay. First time you hear it, it might elicit a chuckle. It seems like the problem here is that there's just too many different tastes. I think this is probably true with music. This is probably true with food. This is probably true with any of these things that we have really, strong kind of opinions about, strong and individual opinions about. Like, there's not really a group or anything like that you can be in and discuss these things and be like, yes, this is the optimal economic system. Like, you can do that. But there's just a few different types of economic systems, really. I mean, what, a dozen maybe at most? But with jokes, there's a lot of different kinds of jokes. There's a lot of different songs or even genres of music and things like this. And so what happens is that everyone has extreme opinions on something. They really like it or they really won't. Some jokes are too dirty for some people, and some people really like dirty jokes. Some jokes are too absurd, and some people really like absurd jokes. I love absurd jokes. And so what you end up with is a joke that is just kind of like, it's fine. Everybody thinks it's fine. And if you looked at everyone's favorite song, like the song that is the favorite of everyone in the country or the English-speaking world or possibly the world, it'd probably be a song that's fine. It's not anyone's real favorite, but overall, if we rated all the songs, you pull out one thing that's just fine. So it's impossible to find the funniest joke because it's just too individual. Okay, let's talk about automatic processes and lexicons. Some things, like reading, are really difficult to stop. It's hard to not read. I mean, even if you look at this picture over here, you see things like fav, tra, greater than, chord, sag. It's really difficult to not, harmony is down there, Chilean harmony, all these things, study one. It's hard to not read these words. In fact, sometimes if you glance over a few words at a time just by moving your head, your brain will kind of put together the letters that it has saccaded onto and make you read something that wasn't there. So it's a very difficult process to stop. It's automatic. Those are automatic processes. It implies that the brain is going to process this information really without a cognizant desire for you to do so. You're not telling yourself to read, it's just doing it. You have to tell yourself to run. You have to tell yourself to make lunch. You don't necessarily have to tell yourself to breathe, although you can. And you can force yourself to read, but it also seems like breathing, reading tends to be an automatic process. One of the ways that we know this is the Stroop task. What the Stroop task does is it looks at the reading time, or actually, sorry, the color naming time. You're going to be naming the color of words. Now, if the color of the word is the same as the word, it's really easy to do. So you'll see red written in red. You can say red. You'll see blue written in blue. You can say blue. But when you have to name the color that the word is written in, and it is a different word that's there, and I don't mean like the word difficult or stop. If difficult is in red, stop is in blue, you can say red, blue. No, I mean the word brown is written in red, the word yellow is written in blue, and you have to say what color it's written in. This ends up severely impacting response time, reading time. Or not reading, sorry. The reading is the automatic thing. Response time of saying the color naming time. And that's because the reading is automatic. You have to train yourself to stop reading, or at least to ignore what you've read and just go with the color of the thing. We also see that we have different sentence processing times based on ease. So we're still going to be thinking about processing time, just like we're thinking about the processing time for automatic processes. Trying to inhibit reading and just go to color naming creates a much longer processing time than just reading the color that's congruent with the color that it's printed in. So now we're thinking about sentence processing time. Remember we were talking about processing time for words in the last exam. We had things like the regularity effect, the neighborhood effect, all this stuff. And the more regular something was, the more common something was, the smaller the neighborhood would lead to faster processing time. We have things like this in sentence processing as well. One of the issues comes up with passive sentences that have an interchangeable subject and object, which means that both of them are agents. So we can have a sentence here that says, the doctor was handed the scalpel by the nurse. If you're reading this too quickly, it could certainly be the doctor handed the scalpel to the nurse, right? Everything is in the same order. Doctor, hand, scalpel, nurse. Now it's passive, so the doctor was handed, he obtained the scalpel by the nurse. The nurse was doing the giving. But because this also makes sense as the doctor handed the scalpel to the nurse, you're going to have slower processing times on this sentence because it could be an active voice sentence going the other way. If you have a passive sentence that says the scalpel was dropped by the doctor, you can't. The scalpel doesn't drop the doctor. The scalpel is not likely to be an agent. So the scalpel was dropped by the doctor is going to be processed a lot more quickly than the doctor was handed the scalpel by the nurse because it's not interchangeable to make a different meaning. The scalpel can't drop the doctor. We also have faster processing times when we start with a specific antecedent and then go to a categorical one. So if we're talking about the antecedent is specific, then we go to a categorical tag. So we would say, John Blobbity Blue is a surgeon who works blah, blah, blah. The doctor picked up his coffee and started to drink. right? So we went specific. We go like John something is a doctor, and then we're going to get a little bit wider, and we're going to call him the doctor, right? So this is how we're going to go that way. If you go the other way around, the doctor walked into the room. John something said to the nurses, I'm going to do this surgery. And so you're not really sure if we're talking about the same person, because you've started with a really broad categorical antecedent, then you've gone very specific. It doesn't work very easily that way. In the book, what you're talking about with this is the shark and then the fish. So if you say the shark was here and then the fish swam away, the fish was here and then the shark swam away. It makes more sense that the shark was attacking people and then no one saw the fish for the rest of the day, versus the fish came in and was attacking people and no one saw the shark for the rest of the day. Now, I have a little bit of an issue with this because people don't tend to think of sharks as fish. They are. So I don't necessarily think that the book's example is like the best, because you can have shark and fish. People thinking of shark and fish as two different things. But I think the doctor and then a specific surgeon is a better example. You're starting with the surgeon, then you can broaden it to the doctor. Faster processing time, nobody's confused. If you start with the surgeon and then you go to a doctor, then it gets too broad. Whoop! You start too broad and then you start narrowing it. Then you're not sure if we're going to a different person. Confusing myself. Sorry about that. All right. So that's processing time. Starting specific, this surgeon, and then the doctor, broadening it. It's easy to link. You can tell that you're referencing the same person, but the other way is difficult. And then we'll talk about different lexicons. Now this relates as well, because we'll see that if you're thinking about things in different ways, you end up having faster processing time. Let's go with phonemic versus semantic. I think this is the obvious link here. So we can think about things phonetically, or we can think about things semantically. Phonetically is going to be something like, hey, what are words that sound like snit? Like, what starts with this kind of sound? Snow, snooze, snap, stuff like that. It's a very phonetic kind of processing. It seems like we have a way to tap into a lexicon that is a phonetic lexicon. Rhyming. What rhymes with this? Again, it's phonetic. There's no reason why two words would have to go together semantically if all you're doing is rhyming them. So there's a phonemic lexicon. If you're thinking phonetically, you're primed to think phonetically, and then you're going to look for words that start with a certain sound. That's going to happen faster. If you're thinking semantically, you're thinking like a thesaurus. You're using your brain as a thesaurus. What is another word for red? Well, ruby, sanguine, rouge, all this stuff. Crimson, etc. And then you're asked to think of words that sound like something. You're primed to think semantically, and then you're going to be tasked with doing the opposite. That's going to take longer. And so this is evidence that we have two different kinds of lexicons, a phonemic one that's just a sound-based level, and a semantic one that goes on a meaning-based level. We also have some other ones of these, like spoken versus written lexicons, and input versus output lexicons. Spoken versus written. We have different lexicons for when we're actually speaking. We know that we speak differently than we write. And one of the reasons for this is it seems like we just tap into a different network, a different associative network of words when we're speaking versus when we're writing. There's things that we can say that just don't translate well to the page. And vice versa. If you talk like a book or even a paper or anything like that, it's weird. It sounds like you're reading. So there's two different kinds of lexicons there, input versus output. Well, now we can think about things like aphasia, right? So an output lexicon is like someone with Broca's aphasia. They can understand everything you're saying to them, but they have words that they just can't get out. The output lexicon for them is impaired. Access to it is impaired. But the input lexicon is fine. And likewise, you can think about Wernicke's aphasia as a problem with the input lexicon. No idea what is being asked of them or said to them, and yet they can output words just fine. The way that they're stringing words together might be a little weird, but the words actually come out just fine. And so it looks like there's two different lexicons there as well. Okay. It seems like the scientific community is most accepting, I should say, of two different input versus output lexicons. The other two, some people think that there's these different lexicons of things like spoken versus written, phonemic versus semantic. But it also could just be that there are different connective pathways that are primed when you're thinking of something different. Now, is that the same thing as two different lexicons? It might be. It might be. Connecting things in a different way might just make a different lexicon. Taking a book of different entries, taking a thesaurus, all the pages out of a thesaurus. I have one right here. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't want to come out. It's kind of stuck. And you rearrange the pages or the entries in the thesaurus so that they all rhyme, like you put together rhyming words. Have you made a different book? Is it still a thesaurus? Not really. It's a rhyming dictionary. So it could be that having different neural connections between these words, but the words themselves are not necessarily different. It's not like you're opening a different book when you're thinking about these different lexicons. It might just be that they're connected differently. That might be the same thing. But it does seem like a lot of neuroscientists believe that input and output lexicons may actually be two separate books. Possibly. Whoops. Go back. There we go. Okay, so let's talk about agents. We talked about this just a little bit when we were talking about active and passive sentences and reversible and irreversible sentences. By the way, the first one, this passive, the doctor was handed the scalpel by the nurse. This is a reversible sentence because it can go the other way. The doctor handed the scalpel to the nurse. But the scalpel was dropped by the doctor can't be the scalpel dropped the doctor. That's an irreversible sentence. So the agent is the thing that's active. It's the one that's doing the acting. It's the doer. But it's not always the subject of the sentence. So the doctor was handed the scalpel by the nurse. The subject of the sentence is the doctor. And this person is getting a scalpel from the nurse. The nurse is the one doing the giving. So she's the agent. If we flip it, if we do the reversible sentence, the doctor handed the scalpel to the nurse. Now, the subject is still the doctor. But as she's handing the scalpel to the nurse, she's also the agent. She's the one doing the acting. And essentially what's going on here is when you have a sentence that has two possible agents, only one of them is actually going to be the agent, but two different parts of speech that could be an agent. I don't want to say nouns because a scalpel is a noun as well. So I guess it's nouns that could be an agent. If they could both be agents, this becomes a reversible sentence. If one of them is much more likely to be an agent than the other, like scalpel and doctor is much more likely to be an agent, then it's irreversible. Now you could have a sentence, the scalpel traced along the gray dead flesh of the murder victim or something. They're doing an autopsy. And in this case, the scalpel is the agent. But it's unlikely when you have a sentence like with scalpel and doctor and dropped. It's unlikely that you're going to use the scalpel as an agent. So it could. It's not out of the question that you could use these, but it's just much less likely. And you see that over and over and over again, that we're talking about probability, not 100% for sure. And this comes up when we talk about where does new information occur in a sentence. Well, at the end, usually. It's usually at the end. So we're going to start with information, we're going to hit you with new information at the end. But again, this isn't 100% true always. It's just kind of most probable. We talk about this when we talked about the SVO order of English, subject, verb, object. It's usually that way, but we don't always have to go that way because you have passive sentences. The doctor handed the scalpel to the nurse. The subject does the verbing to the object. Okay, but then you can have the passive sentence where the doctor was handed the scalpel by the nurse, and then you've got still he's the subject, but you can set this off with commas. To the doctor, the nurse handed the scalpel. Now, the subject is the nurse, but the object comes first because it's set apart by a comma, and so it doesn't happen all the time, but mostly. It's most probable that we have subject, verb, object order. It's most probable that information occurs at the end of a sentence. It's most probable that scalpel is not an agent. Are we good at remembering exact phrasing? No. It's least probable that we're going to remember the exact phrase that someone has said, or even that we've said. But we're really good at remembering gists. So I've got a sentence here. I've got two sentences here. I've got two old men crossed the street. They were slow and used walkers. Now, when you go to take the exam and you think about these two sentences or a sentence, one sentence, or three sentences, or however many sentences I had here, two old men crossed the street. They were slow and used walkers. What you might remember, because you're kind of building this image, the words are cueing an image that you're building here, is that two old men slowly crossed the street using walkers. If I asked you if that's what you saw, you might likely say yes, that's what I saw. Because it's true, the gist of it is right. All of the important information is there. There's two old men, they're slow, they're crossing the street, and they're using walkers. And so it's all, the important stuff is all there. But that's not the exact wording that you saw. But again, we're terrible at remembering exact wording. We're really good at remembering what we've pictured, what's in the scene, the gist of what we've either read or heard. Okay. So the last thing that we're going to talk about here are more garden path sentences and modularity of language. Okay, so we've got some sentence-based explanations for garden path sentences. We've had a lot of like word-based explanations for garden path sentences, and we've got some sentence-based ones as well. Like now you can see that everything that we're doing here is kind of like a sentence-based. We've built ourselves up all the way to just talking about sentences. I'm just changing a setting on my computer. The battery saver came on, and it is probably going to have choppy video and possibly audio. So what I'm going to do is put it on best performance, and it'll record really fast. And I'm just going to hope that I can get everything recorded before it dies. Okay, I think we're good. So this is a sentence from a Stephen King novel that I really like. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. Now, this is really good as an opening sentence to a novel. This is the first sentence, very first sentence in the book, The Gunslinger, which has like 7 or 8 books in it total, and they're of varying quality. So what's going on here? The reason why this is a great sentence for the opening of a book is it kind of like conjures a world almost of what's going on. You're using the and a specific identifier. And what this does is it implies that there's other people. There's a history with the man in black. Why is it not just the man? There's specifically a man in black. And then the gunslinger. So it's not just like a man fled across the desert and another man followed. It's the man in black and the gunslinger. So it's, you know, saying that there's specifically this guy is one guy and this guy is another guy. So it implies that there's other people here, there's a history, there's something going on. It means that there's some information that we should have and we don't. Now, as an opening sentence to a book, we kind of want to know more information here. But thinking about garden path sentences, it means that it's going to increase the processing time because it feels like there's more information that should be here. So if we have a sentence like the prime number few, the prime number few, the prime, which then implies that there are some that are really good. There's also subprime, the subprime, and the mediocre. We don't necessarily know this, so this is increasing our processing time. The old man the boat. Even I add prosody into this. So you understand I'm talking about the old people man the boat. So that means they're old, and then we're contrasting that with the young people. So for some reason, it's important that the old people are manning the boat. So this is what is increasing processing time. There's something about prior information, that the phrasing here of the prime, the old, it implies that there's previous information. This doesn't invalidate anything that we've talked about at the word level for garden path sentences. It's just another reason why some garden path sentences can take longer to process and can be confusing. It's less likely that when someone just says a phrase like this, that it's going to imply previous information. People don't usually just jump into the middle of a story like that. And so then you might think the prime number, because they're not talking about the really good ones. They're just talking about the prime number. Okay, so I'm going to go with that. The old man, the boat, well, we haven't talked about any young people or age or anything like that, so I think I'm going to go with the old man. So it's just another reason. Again, not invalidating any of the ones we've talked about already. So what is a modular theory of language? What it means is that you have specific types of processes that are happening independently. This is kind of like multiple lexicons. They're happening independently. You can have a phonetic one happening, and then at another time you have a semantic one happening. You're using these different modules at different times. They can be happening at the same time. We're talking about these theories of language, but they're independent. And you can have weak and strong interactive models of these modular theories. So a weak interactive module means they don't interact very often. The modules are only going to share information when it's necessary. So like, let's say an ambiguity arises, the old man, the boat. And then you hear the sentence and you go, what the hell? The old man, the boat. You're just saying a list of two things. And so then you have to try to use other modules to figure this out. A strong interactive modular theory of language is going to imply that all these modules are always sharing information. They're working together and things are being shared all the time. And we can have different types of these models too. So we can have a constraint-based model. This would be a strong interactive type of model, and what's going on here is it's maximizing probability. So remember, we talked about how things can be more probable. And again, garden path sentences. Why is something going to be a garden path sentence? Because it's more probable. The ball, the marble. in the internal attractor landscape. Probability makes a well. There can be other wells that are made too, but the more probable one is going to be deeper, and it's going to draw the marble into it without information the other way. So as you're listening to the unfolding of the old man, the boat, the old man, okay, very probable that we're going to say the old man. And here we go. Marble starts coming down, and then the boat, and that's the end of the sentence. And then this kind of goes away. Obviously we're not talking about the old man, or maybe we are, and that kind of stays, and we're talking about the boat. A lot of different wells open up because we're trying to figure out what's going on. And when we finally realize we're talking about the old people, then the marble falls into this now most probabilistic gravity well. That's a constraint-based model. We can have an unrestricted race model, which is going to be a weak interactive model. What happens here is you have different interpretations of sentences all kind of being processed simultaneously by different modules, running, trying to figure things out. And the first one who comes up with an answer is going to be the one that takes it. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the right interpretation. It's just the first interpretation that kind of ended up with some sort of answer. And so that's the one that's going to take it. And then we can also have a good enough model. And you can have a good enough model that's either strong or weak interactive. What's going on here is that language is just not processed deeply all the time. It can often be shallowly processed, and interpretations just are made. Not all of the evidence that's in this linguistic utterance or written passage is analyzed to the full extent. This is when you might have something like the doctor was handed the scalpel by the nurse being interpreted as the doctor handed the scalpel to the nurse. Things are missed. It's good enough. Not everything was analyzed correctly. And this happens because we see errors that shouldn't be predicted by things like a constraint-based or unrestricted race model. So sometimes we don't process deeply. We just kind of go over the top of things, good enough. It processed, it found a meaning, and it's good enough. And that is the last slide here. That should help you with the upcoming exam. There's one other thing that you need to know, which is WH migration, and I have a video on that I'm posting. So watch that video. Watch about flouting Grice's maxims, and go back and study your quizzes, and you should be good. For the final, go back and study your other 3 exams. All right, good luck, and I'll talk to you soon.